We are going to begin our look at the French Revolution today, and we're going to focus on some of the causes leading up to the French Revolution and really understanding some of the background information that we need to know. So the first thing we need to do is start to look at France prior to the revolution and trying to understand what conditions led to this very violent and very bloody revolution, quite different than the American Revolution that we just finished studying in the first part of Unit 2. So let's take a look at the government that France has. So France is, like many countries, a monarchy, but in France we are going to have an absolute monarchy, where the ruling monarch, in this case Louis XVI, has absolute and total control over the population, and the people of France don't really have any power at all. And it's been that way for a very, very long time, almost 200 years. So this absolute monarchy has been sort of ingrained in French society, and Louis XVI is the ruling monarch when the revolution begins in the 1780s. France is also one of the largest countries in Europe, with a population of around 28 to 30 million people. So it's a rather large nation in terms of population and also rather in terms of size. France is a pretty large country. Now, most of the people living in France are going to be poor peasants, and we're going to talk more about the peasants in a little bit. France is also the heart of the Enlightenment movement. So thinking back to Unit 1, the French were very much aware of Enlightenment ideas. Montesquieu and Voltaire and Rousseau especially, Descartes, and a whole bunch of other guys were French. So they were part of French culture. So people in France were aware of the Enlightenment, they knew about the Enlightenment ideas, and were very much tuned into them, especially the bourgeoisie, who we'll meet here in a few minutes. So the Enlightenment's a big part of what happened in the American Revolution, and it will also be a big part of what happens in the French Revolution. There is our portrait of Louis XVI. We will come back to him in a little bit. Now, very important that we understand this part of French society. French society was divided up into what were called estates, and this was known as the Old Regime, and this is going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And basically, the Old Regime meant that France was divided into three estates or three classes. And if you were born into these estates, that's where you were going to live your life for the most part, and that's where you were going to die for the most part. Now, first estate's slightly different because you had to become a member of the church, but we're not going to really get that specific. So there are three estates. We're going to start at the very top and talk about each of them. The first estate is the church, or as we can refer to them, the clergy. People who work for the church, people who are in the church. Not members of the church like you go to church, but people who work for and within the church. Now, the first estate in France is going to make up less than 1% of the population. That's a very, very small percentage. But in return, the church is going to own about 10% of the land in France. And when we talk about owning land, that results in wealth and power. So owning land was equivalent to wealth, power, and status. And the more land you owned, the more wealth you had. And the church owned a lot of land. For being less than 1% of the population, they owned a tremendous amount of land, about 10%. Now, the church is generating a lot of money, both from the ownership of the land that they owned, but also from tithings. So there was a law in France that you had to pay tithings to the church. You had to do it. It was like non-negotiable. So the church is bringing in a lot of money and has a lot of wealth, and therefore also has a lot of power and influence. We've already seen that in our previous unit on Unit 1 when we talked about the influence the church had over people like Galileo, where they had the Inquisition and they brought them in and they put them on trial. So the church is a very powerful part of this culture leading up to the revolution. And we're also going to talk about taxes, something we talked about with the American Revolution. It's going to come back, and we're going to talk about taxes here. The nobility, the clergy in France, the first estate, is going to pay less than 2% in taxes to the king. So with all the money that the church is generating, they are paying out a very small percentage in taxes. So that's a look at the first estate. Now, the second estate is just slightly smaller than the first estate. The second estate is the nobility. These are people with royal titles, like lord, right? Like Lord Ramage, or duke, or duchess, or all the homecoming names. But these are people with noble titles that are given to them by the king. So there is a close relationship between the nobility and the king. The king needs the nobles, and the nobles need the king, and vice versa. Now, the nobles make up about 2% of the population, and they own about 20% of the land, which, again, is an extremely high number for such a small percentage of people. And working on the land are the peasants, okay? So the peasants work the land for the nobles. If you look at the drawing of the people here as my example of the nobility, they are not doing any manual labor. They are just collecting money. They live in a big house. They are well educated. They are well dressed. They eat well. They have servants. And they have all these peasants working for them on their farms. And the peasants are the ones doing all the work and generating all the money, while the nobles really don't do anything. And speaking of not doing anything, they don't really pay taxes to the king either. This is the way for the king to keep everybody on their side, right? So how do I keep the church happy? Well, I only charge them 2% in taxes. How do I keep the nobles happy? I basically don't make them pay taxes at all. So taxes was a way to, keep people on your side. The church needs the nobles. He needs the church. Or the king needs the church and the nobility. So he has to keep them happy, and he does that through low taxes. And then when the king asks you to do something, you kind of need to do it, because if not, he will probably make you pay more taxes. So that is the nobility. They are very powerful, very influential, but a very small part of French society. Now, the first and second estate are definitely against the ideas of the Enlightenment, because these are the two groups that are in power. The Enlightenment was all about changing things, right? Bringing democracy and freedom and liberty to the people, of getting rid of these monarchies and allowing the people to rule. And that was a great idea, but the first and second estate don't want things to change. They don't want the people to have power, because that would mean that they would lose power. They don't want things to change, because that would mean they would have to give up all the great and awesome things that they have. And right now, they are doing awesome. They have tons of money. They don't pay taxes. They live in large. They got beautiful houses. They got beautiful clothes. Everybody listens to them. They're in charge of everything. So yeah, they definitely don't want things to change. But things are going to change. That's what revolutions do. And that brings us to the third estate. And the third estate is basically everybody else, right? So we have less than 1% for the population of the first estate. We have got around 2% of the population for the second estate. And everybody else is made up of the third estate. And these are, there are three groups within the third estate that we need to be familiar with. So we're going to start at the very top with the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie are people who are business owners, people who are artisans. Most of these people live in the city. They own the shops, they own the stores. We don't really have factories yet. So artisans had a lot of money. Artisans are people who make things by hand. And since basically everything was made by hand, they were doing pretty okay for themselves. Not everybody who was a bourgeois was super, super wealthy, but they had money. Most of them were educated. Because they had money, they were able to go to school or to send their children to school and not have to make their children go to work. So they were making money, and in some cases they were wealthier than some of the nobility. But here's the thing, they don't have any privileges like the nobility had. The nobility had all the privileges. And the bourgeoisie, as members of the third estate, were forced to pay taxes, whereas the nobles didn't pay taxes, or hardly any taxes. The bourgeoisie have to pay ridiculously high taxes. Those taxes going to the king, of course. So the bourgeois are making money, but because they're paying so many dollars in taxes, they're not making as much. And the bourgeoisie don't have any power. The first estate, the second estate, they have the power, they have the influence, they have the ear of the king, they can express their voice and the king will listen. But the king's not listening to anybody in the third estate because they're commoners, they're nobodies, they're low class. And the bourgeoisie resent that. They have all this money, they have all this influence within their, little communities and the cities and the business world, but they don't have any influence in the government, and that's what they want. So the bourgeoisie and the third estate, these are going to be the people who are going to lead the early part of the revolution. They're going to be the ones who are going to lead the change that's going to take place in France. They want power. They want influence. People without power, that's what they want. They want power. They want to keep their wealth, they want to keep their money, and they want to have power. They want to have what the nobles have. And the bourgeoisie are big supporters of these Enlightenment ideas because this is what they're talking about. There are way more people in the bourgeoisie than there are in the nobility, so they would be able to outvote them if there was a change in the laws and change in the rules. If we had democracy, then the bourgeoisie would be the ones that would be in charge. So they are definitely big supporters of these Enlightenment ideas. Now, the second group within the Third Estate is called the urban workers, and these are people who lived and worked primarily in large cities like Paris, for example. And we're going to be spending a lot of time in Paris as we look at the events of the Revolution as the capital of France. Of course, it would make sense, right? So the urban workers are living and working in the cities. They are getting paid very, very low wages. They have very little access to food, especially fruits and vegetables, which are very expensive. So is meat and proteins. They are often finding themselves unemployed. So there was a lot of unemployment in these large cities, especially Paris. These people are uneducated from a very early age. They're working, so their children are working. And they don't have time to go to school. They don't have money to afford to buy books. And what little money they do make, they are paying, again, ridiculously high taxes, both to the king as well as tithings to the church. So the urban workers are a larger group than the bourgeoisie. There are way more of them as well. So they're a much bigger group, and they are desperate. These are the people who are going to become ultra-violent during the revolution. These are the people that are going to be supporting the reign of terror. These are the people that are going to be committing the atrocities and the murders and the beheadings and the storming of the Bastille. So these are your desperate, poor people in the cities. They don't have anything, so they've got nothing to lose. So when the revolution turns violent, it's mostly being supported by this group of people. Now, the third part of the Third Estate is everybody else, right? So that's about 80% of the population, or around 26 million people. And these are the peasants. The peasants work out in the country. They typically work on the land that's owned by the nobles or by the king. They work long hours. They're up before the sun and asleep. When the sun goes down, that's pretty much when they're working. They're out in the fields. They're doing the work, planting the crops, harvesting the crops, tending to the animals, doing all those things. They are paid. They're paying about 50% of what they make in taxes and tithings, and they're not making very much, right? So if you're only making $10 a month and you're paying 50% of that in taxes and tithings, you're pretty poor. They're uneducated, not because they don't want to be, but because they don't have access to those resources. They don't have the money to purchase books, or there's really no schools. Any learning that's happening is happening, within the home. And there's really no time to do a lot of that stuff, because being a peasant means you're pretty much working all day long. So they're poor, right? They don't have anything. They don't have any power. They don't have any wealth of to speak of. They have numbers, right? They're a huge group of people, but they're very spread out across the French countryside. They're definitely not united in any way, shape, or form. When we get through the revolution, the peasants are actually going to kind of reject the revolution after a while, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. But it's definitely not the peasants that are going to be the people pulling for the revolution. It's mostly going to come from the urban workers and the bourgeoisie. So looking at some graphics here, just to break down these estates, right? The population is, just overwhelmingly huge. Like the Third Estate, 97 and 98% of the population. The first and second, less than about 2% total. And then the percentage of income, right? The Second Estate's paying basically zero taxes. The First Estate, 2%. The Third Estate, 50% in taxes. That is kind of ridiculous. Some imagery that we should take a look at as well, right? This will pop up a couple of times. The First and Second Estate here are literally riding on the backs of the Third Estate. These are some good bullet points, breaks down if you want to pause and add these to your notes. But the Third Estate is, bent over on a cane, literally being crushed as he carries along the First and Second Estate on his back. We'll see some other imagery like that here and throughout as, literally the clergy, which you can tell by the dress, the nobility here, the Second Estate represented sort of by the French soldier, the French officer, crushing the Third Estate down here under the stone. Okay, so again, lots of imagery that we're going to see popping up during the revolution, sort of visualizing these things. Now, the Third Estate is definitely going to embrace the ideas of the Enlightenment. So unlike the first and second estate, the third estate definitely is all in on these Enlightenment ideas because they would benefit them the most. So the ideas about freedom and liberty and ending the monarchy and using logic and reason instead of superstition, all of these things would change, and the third estate would benefit from them. So they definitely are embracing the ideas of the Enlightenment. Speaking of which, Rousseau and Locke, right? Social contract. There really is no social contract with the King of France. He's just sort of the king. People have no rights. They have no power. They have not empowered the king. The king has always had that power. So anything about freedom and democracy would be awesome for the third estate. And democracy is a very important word, right? So when we talked about the American Revolution in Unit 1, we talked about how the colonies had a history of democracy. The colonies were experienced with democracy. And this is going to be important for later on because the French are not experienced with democracy. They don't really know what to do with it when they get it. And that's going to be something for a little bit later on. But the ideas of the Enlightenment also talked about limiting the power of the government. This is interesting because at the beginning of the revolution, we're not going to get rid of the king right away. We're actually going to keep the king, but we're going to take away his powers. That'll change as the revolution changes, right? But the French people want these things. They want to limit the power of the king. They want freedom. They want rights for themselves. They want to be able to have a voice and a choice in what happens in their country. And this is going to be very idealistic at the very beginning of the revolution. And it's going to get quite bloody as we go throughout this revolution. But these are the things that the people in France want. Same things that the people in the colonies wanted, right? So the Americans wanted just more freedom and democracy for themselves, to limit the power of the king that they had over them, and to make sure that people had those natural rights. And speaking of the American Revolution, this is another cause of the French Revolution, right? Without an American Revolution, there would have been no French Revolution. The American Revolution is going to inspire the French to change things, right? So here we have these 13 colonies. Nobody gave them a chance. They were mostly farmers. They were not seen as any kind of threat at all to the might of the British Empire. And here they are, and they did it, right? So this is inspirational to the people of France. You can create change. You can get rid of a king. You can create a government based on democracy and natural rights. People in France were well aware of what was happening in the American colonies. One of the reasons why is because France was very closely allied with the colonies during the war, and France contributed lots of money and resources to the American Revolution, and that's actually going to become a problem for King Louis XVI a little bit later on. Louis wanted England to lose badly. Remember, France had just lost to England in the 7 Years' War, aka the French and Indian War. So France was basically fighting what's called a proxy war. France was fighting with England through the American colonies. So France gave us money and ships and guns, and that helped us to beat the British. But in doing so, weakened the French economy, sent it into debt, and was one of the major factors leading to the start of the revolution. But back to the positives for the French people. The American Revolution is inspirational and is going to actually become somewhat of a model for the French. If the Americans can do it, then we can too. And of course, you're not going to have a revolution without any kind of economic problems. If people are making money, people are generally happy. But when people are not making money and people are starving, things typically change pretty quickly. So France is in some major debt. Louis has been borrowing money from everybody, and nobody's lending him money anymore, and Louis is at some point going to have to pay back all the money that he has borrowed. Louis has overspent. He spends all the time. We're not going to take a ton of time to talk about Louis' ridiculous amount of spending, but trust me, it's a lot. And because the taxes, right? So we're taxing the third estate who's not making any money. The wealthiest people in France are not being taxed. We're taxing the poorest people. And at some point, that's going to become extremely detrimental. If I'm only making $100 a month and I'm paying 50% in taxes, then I can only spend $50. So I can't spend money at all these different businesses, which means those businesses make less money, and this cycle just keeps going and going and going. So high taxes limit profits. People aren't going to be able to make as much money because they're paying so much money in taxes. There's also a couple of seasons where the weather in France is really bad. The summers are really, really hot. The winters are really, really cold. There's a lot of rain, too much rain actually for some of the crops. So they're between droughts and too much rain and too cold and too hot. France is making and producing less food. So there's less food for people to eat. And when there is less food, the prices are going to go up. So less wheat means less bread, which means the price of the bread goes up significantly. And this becomes a major problem. People cannot afford to eat. People have to go a couple of days between meals. That is not good. So you have a mixture of people who are starving, people who are broke, people who are paying too much in taxes, people who are not free, people who are angry, people who are upset, and things are going to get bad really quickly. And on top of that, what do the people see? They see the royals spending money. They see the nobles spending money. They see big houses, fancy clothes, fancy carriages, horses, art, music, all the things that money can buy, and they don't have any of that. So they see this ridiculous spending around them, and that, of course, is going to make them angry. And to try to put it in perspective, right before the revolution is going to begin, the cost of bread was so high that it was equivalent to 1 month's salary. So you would have to work an entire month to feed your family with 1 loaf of bread. So things were getting really, really bad. Okay, that's going to bring us to the poor leadership. So during all of this, the king could have made different decisions. But Louis XVI is not the kind of ruler you want in place when things are going poorly. Louis XVI was never a good king. He was very indecisive. He listened to everybody, but made no final decisions. The people he should have been listening to, he didn't listen to. Louis did not like to sit in on meetings. He did not like the actual job of being the king. He liked all the cool things, right? He liked all the cool things about being the king, but he didn't like actually doing the work of being the king. So Louis was not the right man for the job. Now, his wife, Marie Antoinette, she is a very interesting historical figure. You've probably heard of her before, but she is hated significantly by the French people, even before she gets to France. Because Marie Antoinette is not French, she is Austrian by birth. And France and Austria had a very long history of fighting each other. Well, one way to stop fighting another country is for your ruler's children to marry. So that's what they do. Louis is married off to Marie at a pretty young age. She arrives to France, and she is immediately disliked by the people of France. She's from Austria, number one. She does not speak French when she gets there. Strike number two. She does not have a child for a very long time. One of the main jobs of a queen, or a queen-to-be, is to produce a male heir for the throne. So the throne and the title can be passed down to a son. So she ended up not having a child for a long time, which led to lots of different rumors and scandals, all sorts of celebrity gossip about the king and queen. She eventually had 3 daughters and then eventually a son. So again, she does her job, but it takes a while and it definitely takes a toll on her. She was not the nicest of people. She also spent a lot of money and borrowed a lot of money. She threw out outrageous and extravagant parties, and people would hear about this stuff, right? She never said, "Let them eat cake." That is a historical myth. She never said that. It was said about her, but she didn't say that. And she was a gambler. She was a really bad gambler. She lost a lot of money gambling. And where do the king and queen get their money from? They get it from the people. So the king and queen are throwing away the people's money on all these ridiculous, extravagant things, while the people suffer. And at some point, that's just not okay anymore. And that is a reason why the people are going to be quick to turn on the royal family, because they don't respect them. They don't see people that they trust. They don't see people that they respect. And because of their poor leadership, it's going to lead to the downfall of their country. So that is the first part of our look at the French Revolution. Be sure to take a look at your worksheet so that you can complete some of the key informations that we covered here in part 1.